Mother, father, what's afoot? Only possum black as soot. Mother, father, where to tread? Far from possum and his head. Here's a bag, now what's inside? Does he seek or does he hide? Can you spy him deep within? Little possum, black as sin.
You're trapped in an endless nightmare, a tumultuous battle against your past, and you unwittingly carry around your trauma everywhere you go. Enter the movie Possum, one of the most compelling psychological horrors of 2018, taking influences from 70s English horror and British miserablism. Most striking is its beautiful cinematography showcasing the great Yarmouth, Suffolk, and Norfolk countryside. Filmed mostly in 2016 and directed by Matt Holness, starring method actor Sean Harris along with classically trained Alan Armstrong. It tells the chilling story of an abusive uncle and a man struggling to function with his crippling trauma, which he manifests into a frankly terrifying, half-human, half-spider puppet named Possum. The true brilliance of Possum lies in its atmosphere of discomfort, which is accentuated in three ways: its cinematography, its dialogue/character interactions, and its overall infidelity in general to any sort of plot. Or at least it seems that way on the first watch. In a word, this movie is uncomfortable. It achieves this in a couple of ways. Namely, its use of complete silence with intermittent audio cues that I can't help but admit definitely adds to the effectiveness of the scares. Almost every shot has this beautiful sense of dread and claustrophobia, each crafted to create its tone. And that's what makes this movie work. It's nearly carried by cinematography. The camera is always static and the shots are actually quite simple, yet extremely effective. By the third watch, I found myself just admiring this thoughtful cinematography. While on the subject, let's talk about its influences: 70s English horror and British miserablism. British miserablism is often characterized by a seeming enjoyment or comfort in being depressed or in despair. This is punctuated by the fact that he wakes up facing his trauma, aka Possum, and he carries it around. In fact, the true horror is his uncle, which implies that he finds comfort in his trauma in a way. I'll go deeper into this later though. Now enough about tone, let's talk style. This movie is style. It pays homage to 70s English horror, which stylistically is defined by thorough setups and explosive payoffs that rely more on dread than gore. As the 70s was on the cusp of the age of slashers, which yes have merit when done well, but there's a certain charm to Possum and to similar films that surpass slashers in my eyes. In truth, Possum does have its weak spots, such as lack of plot, which can be distracting to some people, but other than that, it's got a lot going for it. Its camera work, its tone, it's super refreshing in a genre flooded by campy cash grabs. Not naming names, but I kinda am. This movie throws out any status quos or norms established in today's horror movies, and does its own thing, which if nothing else is admirable. But personally, I adore this movie. The dialogue in this movie is, to say the least, tense. More tense than when your extended family asks what you want to do in the future. Yikes. But unlike that, the tense interactions in this movie are excellent. In fact, it's definitely one of its strengths. Matthew Holness opted for a visually driven plot because he took inspiration also from the 20s and 30s silent films, which obviously had no sound. He found these films to be, quote, brilliantly creepy, which to be honest, Possum is brilliantly creepy. But what makes it that way? Well, the brilliant terror of Possum lies in three characters mainly: Possum, Uncle Morris, and Philip, which are all effective in their own ways. Possum is quite terrifying because it fundamentally makes us feel unsafe due to the fact that it looks human, but not quite human. This phenomenon is known as the Uncanny Valley. I'll link a video here that goes into more detail on that. This should also be extra terrifying to Philip since he looks vaguely like Possum, which again proves that Philip feels comfortable, or at the very least identifies with his trauma. He sees himself and it as one. A fun nod to this is shown in the title sequence when a string can be seen attached to Philip's arm, which I didn't even notice until the third watch. Philip is unnerving almost solely due to the phenomenal acting by Sean Harris. Of course, Philip isn't the object of dread directly, but you can definitely see him fall deeper and deeper in despair and self-hatred throughout the movie, which we can identify with. But at the same time, it's not ever obvious whether Philip's point of view can be trusted. Humans fear unknown the most. You sympathize with Philip, yet it's unknown if you should. It's the innocently enigmatic nature of the character, along with his obvious despair and helplessness, that makes any scene Philip's in extremely uncomfortable. Which is great, by the way. And finally, we have Uncle Morris. Not because his actual physical presence, but his perceived presence, especially by Philip. You can tell something's happened in the past, and it's shown in nephew-uncle interactions, which are extremely closed in, as if one word could set off one of them. Another thing that adds to the discomfort is the B-plot, which is about the missing schoolboy. There's only really 2 suspects, and throughout the first watch, you question who kidnapped the schoolboy. Who can you trust? Overall, the character interactions perfectly set up the tone, and also stay true to its influences, while essentially driving the plot. While some may consider this a weak point, Possum abandons the near notion of a linear plot. And while most bad reviews complain about lack of dialogue, lack of plot is rarely discussed. But I definitely see this as a plus. There's recurring locations, yes, but it's hard to judge whether what you're seeing is real or not. And personally, that makes me uncomfortable. And I love it, by the way. Yes, it has a plot, but it doesn't stay loyal to normal film conventions. All of this would normally be a weakness, as it feels like a fever dream. More like a fever nightmare, to be honest. But unlike other fever dream movies, this movie works. This movie has a rather long setup, but if you're patient, you'll receive one of the most stylized and interesting horror sequences I've ever seen. And also terrifying frames like this. Or this one, that gets me literally every time. But we're still in the build-up. You see, Possum is different in the fact that the creepy puppet isn't the quote-unquote bad guy. He never actually tries to hurt Philip. He gets more and more obvious throughout the movie. They rarely show Possum in the beginning, and it's somewhat built up to that first scene you see him in, which builds up fear of Possum almost to the same level Philip experiences, and allows you to understand him on a very personal level, which is terrifying, as Philip is not a functioning human, and at the end of the day, it'll always be uncomfortable to confront those types of flaws in yourself. This movie almost forces you to relate to Philip, or at the very least sympathize, which my friends watching with me stated that they sympathized, but it felt wrong, which leads to my first of 2 assertions about this movie. Possum's plot and characters are crafted specifically to make you feel uncertain. Uncertain about the plot, the character's integrity, and whether even all of this is real. The closest we ever get to certainty is that Uncle Morris is a bad person. But what if I told you none of it was real? Possum doesn't feel real. Nothing feels quite concrete. Now, I'm not saying Philip is in a coma, or this was all a dream. No, this is an ode to Philip's trauma after all, and it wouldn't make any sense if it were just a dream. These seem to be hallucinations, or at the very least manifestations of different facets of Philip's trauma. Possum represents the punishment he puts on himself, as he seems to blame himself for a situation. Possum resembles him, and I think he views Possum as the worst parts of himself, which he has to face and run away from constantly. He wanders the countryside in search of solace, but he can't, at least until the end. But we'll get to that in a bit. Uncle Morris represents a certain force of evil in his life. I don't think Uncle Morris is real, or at least I don't think he's alive. What I mean is that Uncle Morris is what Philip uses to blame his bad qualities on. So essentially, Possum and Morris are polarizing forces in the hell Philip subjects himself to. How can I prove this? Well, it's pretty obvious that Possum's movements are not real, but what about Uncle Morris? Well, for one, the house they both inhabit is dirty, decrepit, and Uncle Morris's presence is never consistent. He's there in some scenes, but not in others. Furthermore, no other characters interact with Morris, and Uncle Morris's actions and behavior are not consistent either. Sometimes he's mean, sometimes he's nice, and sometimes he's just disgusting. Now, when it comes to the schoolboy, I have two theories. One is that Philip actually kidnapped him, and as part of his malfunction is the fact that he can't face what he did, so he blames Morris in his head. This is backed up by the fact that he seems to know where the schoolboy is, and that room seems to have a lot of power. Speaking of that room, I have another theory. Since we've established that Philip is in his own hell, he also replays memories over and over again. It's a cycle. Okay, so what does that mean? I think Uncle Morris kidnapped or kept Philip captive for a period of time until he was set free either by cops or via Morris's death. And I think he wishes he was the one to kill him. So essentially, the end of the movie is Philip confronting his trauma and ending his cycle of self-hatred, which makes this movie more optimistic than it seems. In fact, the last subtitle of the movie is just the words, optimistic music. I much prefer this theory, and it's my headcanon, because in the end, we can't help but root for Philip. Maybe we see ourselves in Philip. You know, maybe, just maybe, that's not so bad.